Hi, everybody. We're recording, we're all good with this. Awesome. My name is Laura Duffy, and I'm a recently graduated master's student from Oregon State University. I just finished my master's in water policy and management. Today, I will be talking about something that I've been working on for the last 2 years with the support of the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program here in Klamath Falls and Oregon State. So my talk today is engaging agricultural landowners in fish habitat restoration on private land, lessons from a tough case. And just before we get started, I wanted to say the impetus for this talk was really the idea that you can have, all the technical capacity, you can have increased financial capacity, but if you don't have that social capacity, those relationships with people, it's going to be really hard to get your job done if your goal is getting projects on the ground, especially in a community with a lot of both challenging history and also history of collaboration. So that's the thing I want to plant is, wow, social science can be helpful in navigating these situations. Quick overview, we'll get into the problem, research question and methods, results, applications, our discussion section, and then I'll have time for questions at the end. I welcome any feedback that you'll have for me. First, let's talk about what the problem is. So, in the United States, over 60% of land is private land. And that means that when we think about private landowners and landscape scale restoration, they become really, really important conservation partners. And a lot of time, they're already doing stewardship on their own property, or they're already engaging in restoration work without the support of government. But we know that a significant amount of critical habitat for species listed under the ESA is on private land. And that can create a lot of challenges, especially for federal agencies looking to have access to those landowners and to those critical habitat areas. In addition, many rural communities can have negative associations with implementation of the Endangered Species Act or habitat restoration in general. So in many cases, there's this need to build or repair trust. So if you can't access people and they don't trust you, good luck doing the work that you need to do to reach your restoration goals. Now in the Upper Klamath, we see that antecedent conditions related to ESA implementation and tribal and non-tribal relations. So here we're thinking about antecedents for collaboration. Are they strong or weak based on past experiences of community members and current political and social dynamics? This creates a tough case for collaboration. And so we have these gaps in knowledge with how to engage private landowners in voluntary conservation in these tough cases where there might be a difficult history or some narratives about the federal government that need to be overcome. And in many cases where our community members might be struggling. And there has been some previous research, but it's been primarily quantitative or mixed method. So one might say, oh, why don't we send some surveys out and get get an idea of landowner attitudes towards restoration, or what would make folks be more motivated to participate in our programs. Well, that's a great idea and has been done in other communities in the past. We also know that mailing surveys out, especially in a lot of rural communities, you don't always get the response rate to make any significant claims. So we find that there's this need for really in-depth qualitative data, also to better understand kind of nuanced community dynamics that can help inform our practices. So just to get at why this is important, on the bottom of my slide, you'll see 2 quotes from interviews I conducted. If you can't see it, I'll read them out. First, I used to joke that we need a GIS layer that shows agreeable landowners. And second, no. Our first reaction when somebody comes to us wanting to do something is no. So we have this tension here, right? What are we going to do about that? So this study, which was also part of my master's thesis, had a number of research questions, but for today we'll focus on one. How can conservation professionals increase landowner engagement in habitat restoration projects in tough cases? So where the antecedents for collaboration is weak. And to answer this question, I employed all qualitative methods. So this might be a different kind of talk than you're used to hearing at these kind of things. So starting with the literature review, mainly focusing on human dimensions, fish and wildlife, human dimensions of habitat restoration, ecological restoration, document analysis, gray literature, so documents such as the Upper Klamath Basin Watershed Action Plan that came out in 2021. Bulk of this project was centered on semi-structured interviews. Now, phase one, we wanted to know what are the kind of best practices for working with private landowners to do habitat restoration? What do we know about this generally? So we interviewed national subject matter experts from a variety of organizations doing restoration work on private land, as well as some kind of well-known landowners in this space who have been doing this for a long time on their own property, just to get an idea of what do we know generally. And then we conducted a case study. I'll move. I guess you can't see the last thing, but that's okay. Phase two and three, we were focusing on our case study in Klamath. So we interviewed local experts in the Upper Basin, so people who work in the restoration sphere, or folks who can provide context to not only the social dynamics, but current environmental and political dynamics going on in the basin. And then phase three, we interviewed landowners in the Upper Basin. Thank you.
Mouse go. Where's the mouse? Where's the mouse?
There we are.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great. And once we interviewed folks, we took those interviews, which were recorded. We transcribed all of them, so turning them into text documents. We anonymized them, so removing all identifiers from folks that we interviewed. And then I inputted it into qualitative analysis software called In Vivo. And from there, I began a process of coding my interviews for emergent themes. And there's a variety of ways that you can do this, but the method I employed was using grounded theory, which means you're looking inductively for the major themes that came up. You create a hierarchy of themes from vague to more specific, all supported by direct quotes from community members. So we're looking at, we're looking for saturation, making sure that we cover the array of topics that were mentioned within interviews, as well as noting which seemed to be the most important. So if something came up, a large number of times, or if someone said specifically, this is the most important thing, that's when you would code it as, having kind of a higher impact on the topic that we were examining. And then finally, participant observation. That just means attending relevant decision-making settings. So going to public meetings, going on some site visits. Almost every interview I conducted with the landowner was on their property. So getting to walk that property with that person while we're doing that interview. So results split up into two sections. First, what do we know about this? What does the literature say? Well, first, in general, we know that antecedent attitudes, values, and beliefs influence behavior. So when we're thinking about environmental behavior and adopting new behaviors, that can be influenced by how we already feel about the world, our worldviews. And that can be really difficult to change and often does not change on short timescales. We also know that incentives can work, but they work better if they're context dependent, if they are place-based. And those incentives can be economic and non-economic. And we also know that relationships are a key to success. This one can be hard to study, but we know that trust is built in this process, starting with building legitimacy. It's this kind of stepping stone to trust. Building legitimacy when a community member knows what you're doing, knows who you represent, and knows what you want to do. Credibility is built by doing what you say you're going to do. And that can create space for trust to grow, which is all about community members' acceptance of you and psychological buy-in to whatever you're doing. Trust, which I explored deeper in this study, but won't be reporting on too much today, can be broken up into 4 types according to Stern and Coleman. So when we think about trust in natural resource management, we think about the party who's trusting us. We think about us maybe as the person being trusted, but a landowner also has to trust the process, the systems that we're operating in. So maybe trusting that this bureaucratic system or that the legal system will serve them. And they're also trusting in the outcomes of a project. How much risk are they willing to take on? And what they know about you and what they can predict about your behavior will influence how much they trust you. So demonstrating that you're competent and demonstrating that you are doing what you say you're going to do are 2 really big things that we think about in terms of building trust. So phase 1, when we interviewed experts in the private restoration sphere, mostly in the US West, we asked them a variety of questions, went in with an interview guide and asked about what they think best practices are for engaging with private landowners, specifically in stream and riparian habitat restoration. We also asked if they had any red flags, green flags, cautionary tales, things that were really successful for them in the past, things that failed. We wanted to hear, kind of the best advice they had to give. And a lot of these folks might be your peers. And here we have these really high level themes. For each of these, I have sub-themes and second sub-themes that are supported by quotes. So just giving you the high level look, some of these might be no-brainers for folks in this room, as many of you are experts, all of you are experts yourselves. But we'll dig into one specific one just to give you an idea of what this study looked like. So first, get to know your community. We'll talk about that one in a second. Second, build trust and keep your word. So making sure that we're being really cognizant of the perceived risks that that landowner is taking on, and making sure that we can do what we can to minimize those perceived risks. And keeping your word, do what you say you're going to do. Make sure that person can see that you're competent and that you're committed to assisting them. The 3 is facilitating social learning. And social learning really is all about peer-to-peer connection and learning from one another. This is reciprocal. So how can we support activities like a workshop or a field trip that encourage landowners to talk to one another, that encourage landowners to talk to restoration professionals, where we can learn from them, they can learn from us, creating that reciprocal relationship. In addition to that, recognizing that one-on-one conversations can lead to social learning going forward. So having coffee with the landowner, sitting down at someone's kitchen table, investing that time, and knowing that if that goes well and you continue to build that relationship, they might spread the news to neighbors and friends. Next is addressing concerns and myths about the ESA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So because this project was funded by partners, we were focusing a lot on U.S. Fish and Wildlife and folks' attitudes towards that agency in the basin. But what we noticed is in general, in this general case, a lot of experts mentioned being prepared to have conversations with folks who, might be anti-government or might have, concerns about working with the government in general, might have heard horror stories about somebody being charged with a take, whether that's in their community or not. So being prepared and having that toolbox of assurances to make sure a landowner knows, hey, I hear you, that's scary. I want to make sure that doesn't happen to you. It won't happen to you. Here's what we know. And here's what actually happens in this voluntary habitat restoration process. So emphasizing the voluntary nature of programs like this. Next, reducing bureaucratic and financial burdens on landowners. We heard about this a lot. So minimizing things like paperwork, making sure that you've communicated that sometimes project timelines are long and that you're going to stick with this person through that timeline. Financial burdens, ensuring that cost share agreements are working for the landowner. If somebody is really struggling, figuring out how to pull funding, cobble it together with community partners to make sure that's not going to be a really big point of stress for that person. Next, recognize pros and cons of prioritization tools. This one is really interesting. We love prioritization. We love identifying critical habitat and where we can best spend our resources, right? But something that we heard a lot from folks was people don't like to feel like that their property is being targeted. So this one is really about the language that we use when talking about critical habitat and where we're focusing. While some landowners might be on board knowing that they're on a special piece of land, we also know that many folks are already feeling defensive having you onto their property. So just being aware of how we talk about that, making sure someone doesn't feel like they are being targeted. And then proper pacing, project rightness, and value of small wins. This one is all about not rushing into a project, making sure that you develop the right project at the right time with that landowner. And small wins is all about maybe there is a smaller project that we can get done earlier that might be a little easier, where we can demonstrate that we know what we're doing, and that landowner begins to feel more comfortable with that process. So I won't dig into this too much, but just to demonstrate, all of these are built on quotes from community members. I'll put them up so you can read them. First, when we talk about getting to know your community, we have a lot of examples of what that means. So the first is utilizing existing networks. So relying on local partners to make those initial connections, demonstrating genuine care. This expert shared with us, before they ever brought a project up on a piece of property, that you had some sort of relationship, that he knew who I was, that he had some level of trust in me and my concern for him and his operation and his full situation. And lastly, determining community outreach preferences. So this expert said, there are things like your office's website, making sure that's up to date and easy to navigate. So there's some kind of lower cost, lower effort things you can do, like maintaining a website, making sure it's up to date, making sure your contact information is available. And then, progressively we see things that might be more effort, like putting mailings out, maintaining a newsletter, putting flyers out in the community, setting up meetings. All of those were brought up. But knowing your community is also knowing who to go to spread information, where to put that information. So if you're putting a flyer up, is it at the community center? Is it at the coffee shop? Is it at the church? So know your community, think about these things in the context that you're working in. So getting into our case study where we can hear from our local community members. So I put this map up just to show you in red is short-nosed and Lost River sucker habitat, critical habitat. We can see Upper Klamath Lake. It's that big blob of red, and along the Sprague is where we focus a lot of our interview recruitment, accessing a lot of these places where we'd love to have access to, but maybe don't have the relationships, or are working on getting those relationships, or would love to expand the work that we do. So we asked folks about a lot of different things. Questions included, what do you think the greatest barriers to private lands restoration are in the Upper Klamath Basin? And we heard from both practitioners and from landowners. We also asked landowners, what makes you hesitant? What makes you not want to sign up? Let's hear about that. What troubles you? Let's talk about it. So a major theme of why some folks haven't gotten involved yet is a lack of awareness about available programs. So this landowner coded using just L2 that indicates it's a landowner, says, you know, my neighbors use it, but I didn't know they did. I'm not nosy. When we did these interviews, we noticed a lot of times people were surprised to find out that once they started talking to their neighbors, that they've been doing these programs for years, or receiving, you know, government support to put fencing in, or you know, they want beavers back on the property. They were very surprised just to hear from their own community members. So just being aware that some people are really happy to share and excited to share and want people to come see what they've been able to do. And some people are a little more private and might not be as open. Next was financial concerns. This is both related to landowners' concerns about, you know, will this affect the profitability of my operation? That was one of the most important things that we see here in the Klamath Basin. People really want to know, is this going to hurt me in any way? If not, I'm out. And then also, if somebody's struggling financially but might be willing or on the fence about a project, how can you step in and support them? So being aware that some folks aren't in a position to, you know, add this to their mental load. So when you're approaching somebody or maybe having a first conversation, be really cognizant of the fact that this is a community member and another human being. So this is a local practitioner who says, you know, they had a conversation with someone who said, you know, I can't focus on habitat restoration. How can I pay, you know, for shoes for my kid to go to school? Another one is breakdowns in trust. So that, and this one specifically, we're thinking about history in the basin. So this landowner says, a lot of people don't trust the federal government. It's just been so many disappointments for so long. So we noted distrust towards government in general and distrust towards representatives of government or conservation organizations. So that's something, you know, that folks here are navigating. Next is ideological barriers. This is on a couple different levels as well. This could be due to, you know, political ideology. Maybe there's just decreased interest in accepting government help. This could also be, you know, local political frustrations, and in some cases, there were demonstrations of prejudice directed at the Klamath Tribes. So we see, you know, this practitioner says, you know, not agreeing to do restoration just feels like a big middle finger to the Klamath Tribes. And this is something we also saw in a handful of landowner interviews. So figuring out how to work with folks and also recognizing that there's some barriers, that there's a lot of community work to do before we can move forward. Bureaucratic burdens and institutional constraints. So this landowner said, I asked them, you know, what is the #1 hesitation you have? She sighed and just looked at me and said, the paperwork. It's the paperwork, absolutely. But thinking about how we can go about limiting, you know, the energy that someone's pouring into signing up for a project, right? So paperwork, institutional constraints here in the Klamath. Once we heard a lot about staff turnover affecting relationships with private landowners, feeling like, hey, the person I knew left. I'd love to continue doing something, but I just feel kind of left in the dust. So I wish there was a better transition. Or another institutional constraint that we saw was staff capacity, just there being a lot of work to do and not being able to follow up all the time or not being able to communicate regularly with someone. In terms of pathways, so what gets people to say yes? What do we hear from folks in the basin? The first one that came up a lot, the top two will be this one and then the next one, the potential for greater ecological resilience. So this idea that, hey, if you make these changes, you might be able to withstand disturbances moving into the future when we're thinking about impacts from climate change or just even changes to irrigation arrangements. So everybody will benefit from getting the water table to go up. These efforts will also benefit agriculture, so it's not a hard sell. Another one was kind of the flip side of financial concerns was, hey, if I can be more economically resilient, that would definitely get me more interested in this project. So this landowner says, hey, you know, like that improved value, that's really what sold me. If I can get this place fenced and have better grazing opportunities for cows, I'll get more money on the lease. Next, aesthetic and recreational value and affinity for wildlife. This one came up much more than we had expected. So this practitioner says, you know, ranchers and farmers love animals on their land, and I think we take it for granted. We heard from landowners who said they miss the sound of frogs. They miss seeing ducks on their property. They wish they could show their grandchildren the birds that they used to see growing up. This makes a difference for people, but it's really all about understanding, you know, what type of landowner am I working with? Everyone is different, but maybe for them, that's the sticking point. And then a couple other pathways. These are mostly focused on investing in relationships. So something that came up a lot was building and repairing trust at a couple different levels. So one practitioner talks about the benefit of getting together with the conservation network in the Upper Klamath to get to know each other as people outside of a professional capacity. So having opportunities for more informal interaction and just recognizing, hey, we're all community members and we're here to take care of each other and take care of this place that we call home. And then recognizing that there are opportunities for informal and formal interaction with landowners that will also assist in that trust building aspect. And then improved coordination. So mostly improved coordination among our community members and among our conservation network here. Everyone talks a lot here, and that's amazing. And what I heard from every single interviewee was, we need to talk more. It's hard to do, it's hard to make time for, but you know, being able to know what incentives are out there, what projects are going on, how we can cobble together the resources that we have to best serve community needs and respond to things as dynamics change. That came up throughout our Klamath Basin case study. So discussion, just a couple practical strategies to end on for thinking about, great, you covered a lot, and some of it was quite general. So what are some specific strategies for engaging landowners? So I'll talk about these, but I will also let you know that I'm finishing up a technical report that I'm delivering to the Fish and Wildlife Office here that gets into this topic in great detail and includes narratives from a lot of our community members about their thoughts on this. So first, communicating co-benefits. Something that we saw in the Klamath Basin specifically was that, you know, a lot of times it's not communicating about how great this will be for fish habitat. We really need to focus on what are the perceived risks that this landowner is taking on and how can I manage those? And for a lot of folks, it's communicating about that ecological and economic resilience. How will this help them? Next, supporting activities that develop shared understanding and community buy-in. So doing that work to keep your website updated, to get mailings out, but a lot of those great connections and trust building and peer-to-peer sharing happens at workshops, field trips, listening sessions. We heard from landowners who said, I was on the fence for a long time, but I kept going to meetings, or when I finally put a face to the name, I started to think I could get on board. Next, build landowner trust in you and your organization. When we start looking at ways to build trust, where we noted trust was most weak, as part of the study, we did a exploration of kind of degrees of trust available and where they can be improved. We noticed that a lot of landowners are concerned about trusting in outcomes of restoration. How will I know that this will help me? And while we all know you can't necessarily promise that a project will do exactly what it says on paper, and sometimes you need to make changes, doing the best you can to communicate, you know, this is what we believe will happen, this is what will likely happen. Do you want to see some examples of projects in your community? do want to hear from folks who had the same questions that you had. And then the next one is demonstrating your positive qualities. So this is about a type of trust where the landowner is trusting in you as a person based on how they expect you to behave. In this case, demonstrating that you're honest, that you're being respectful. So, going onto somebody's property, taking your sunglasses off, being a human being, being open to opening the gate for somebody, if they're driving around their property. Follow through, doing what you say you're going to do, and maintaining communication throughout the course of a project. Those are the things we heard about most from landowners. I asked them, what qualities do you appreciate the most in a project partner? Honesty, respect, follow through, and technical competency. So those are things I want to leave you with today. I have a lot more that I've done with this project and happy to talk to you more. But right now I'd love to move into questions. And I just want to give special thanks to the Partners Program for helping fund this study, my advisor, Hannah Gosnell, OSU's Water Resources Grad Program, and all the interview participants that made this study possible. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Jeff Kerber, Klamath Watershed Partnership. So was the focus on the feedback from the Impact and Partners Program on how to change landowners' opinions, or was there any feedback on how Wildlife Service could maybe change the policies, or how landowner opinions could better inform improvements to the ESA? For example, turning critical habitat or the presence of an endangered species from a burden into economic benefit?
That's a really good question. This project specifically was designed to inform specific restoration activities in the basin. So thinking about how practitioners and managers interact with landowners, how we think about our processes related to engagement and outreach, not necessarily collecting kind of community input on policy change. Though that is something we did hear a lot about, from both kind of our subject matter experts and landowners, feeling frustrated with the ESA and pointing out specific things that could change. But this project was not necessarily meant to inform, changes in regulation. However, something that we heard about was, sometimes you have to view the ESA in some ways as a common enemy, as, hey, this is what we're working with, but we'd love to help navigate you through. And, we'd love to help, work towards preserving ecosystem function on your property to make sure that it will be resilient going forward.
And separating yourself from as a representative, maybe separating yourself from some of those policies.
Yeah, so that was a nugget of advice that we got, that some restoration practitioners have gotten traction with. But yeah, the study was not designed to influence federal policy.
All right. A little louder, please.
Curious if, for example, for Everglades, other parts of the U.S., you find information that helped you formulate some of these ideas. I use the Florida Everglades as an example because I know there's a lot of restoration that's taking place there. Do you find any parallels with the Klamath Basin, any other geographic regions of the U.S.?
Yes. What we also continue to discover was this is a tough case, right? Every region has its own restoration concerns, and you're dealing with a completely different group of people, raised with different community histories and kind of a memory. There's a collective memory of what has happened here in the past that influences how people think about decisions they'll make today. That being said, I was really looking for folks who had experienced with wetland restoration and stream riparian areas that were arid. So we, got to talk to somebody who focuses on Eastern Washington, talked about folks, met with folks in Eastern Oregon. And then just in terms of this type of research has been conducted a lot in Montana. So looking at the Blackfoot Challenge in Montana, that was an area that we thought about immediately, where they've had a lot of success in collaborating to do community-based conservation. And so I got to interview some folks involved in that in the past and, ask questions like, how did you do it? How did you get folks in the room? What was it like to, kind of start, not just from scratch, but, start from a place where there was a lot of distrust and move towards, getting a lot of landowners signed up and really on board and leading the charge to do this type of work. So I don't know if that really answered your question, but similar studies in the past in the Blackfoot really helped us formulate our thinking.
All right, last question.
And just keep with updation. I represent an entirely dispossessed group of people. And I also have a background as a professional communicator with a federal agency. I no longer work there because of lack of support for that discipline. And so this is kind of a tough pill to swallow in a number of ways. It's very positive and upbeat, and I appreciate that. But I'm kind of wondering about those more responsibility driven kind of, social justice messages. Was there an aspect of your research that led into that kind of landowner responsibility for what occurred on that land historically?
Yeah, thank you for your question. In this presentation today, we were really trying to think about what can I practically leave as things that can influence people's day-to-day kind of operations. But my master's research also brings in questions about power, questions about responsibility. So we did get feedback when doing these interviews. I asked, what do you envision for this place? What do you envision for the basin? And how can we get there? And we got a variety of answers, but some of those answers included, there's a reckoning that has to happen that hasn't really happened. Reckoning with history of colonization in the basin, and a feeling trauma, and recognizing that oppression has occurred in this landscape. And just in terms of, property ownership, that is, for some folks really touchy, but there was a recognition that some folks feel like they have a moral responsibility or that it's the right thing to do restoration. So we did see that. And, this project was really focused on people who are on the fence or who might be anti-government, who, folks that are kind of hard to reach. What do we know about what would get them on board? But I think that, exploring power dynamics further would be really beneficial and creating space for social learning for people to step back, people who are new to this landscape and, arrived during settlement to step back and listen. And I know everybody in this room is grappling with that here in terms of how they can best support moving forward in this place. But I did focus on that a bit more in that longer piece, just because I feel like those narratives kind of better come through in that longer form. But thank you for bringing that up today.
All right, Laura, thank you so much.